and Hammerstein both attended Columbia University. And at Columbia, they collaborated on some shows there. But after that time, they went two different directions and ended up with different working partners. But finally, in the mid-1940s, the two of them got together because their previous partners and they had had some sort of divorce. So they got together, and what they went out to prove is that a lyrics-first approach to writing Broadway musicals would be more effective, more emotional, capture the audience better than write the music first and then try to squeeze the lyrics to match. This was very new in New York and Broadway, but actually not so new because Gilbert and Sullivan had done that same thing back in the mid-19th century. But everybody lost their approach since then. So Rodgers and Hammerstein decided to bring this up. So what would happen, the process would be, Hammerstein had a farm in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. And he'd go to the farm, and he'd sit in this room that you see, there he is sitting, and he'd write the lyrics of the songs, and then he would either telegraph them, remember the days of telegraph, to Rodgers. If there were too many lyrics, then he might send a letter, and if he was in a hurry, he'd call him up on the phone and dictate it to him. Then Rodgers, who had a farm in Fairfield, Connecticut, would write the music. And often he'd write the music in a matter of a day, sometimes even 4 or 5 hours. Rodgers was really good at coming up with the tunes. For their first collaboration, 1943, they decided to take a show that had played on Broadway as a stage play, Green Grow the Lilacs, and set it to music. It was a very strange show in some respects. It took place in the Oklahoma Territory. It was a farm girl in the early 1900s who was trying to decide who to go to a dance with. Should she go with the farmhand that she's afraid of, or the cowboy she loves? Very odd subject. In fact, the story in the musical takes a very strange turn when the farmhand turns out to be a psychopathic murderer. And the heroic cowboy is forced to kill him in self-defense. This is very unusual for a musical, particularly in 1943. Very strange. And this was very much in contrast to, and you remember them. Who remembers Gene Autry and Roy Rodgers? This doesn't sound like either Gene Autry or Roy Rodgers. This is a different kind of cowboy musical. And this was the middle of World War II, of course. To further complicate things, this show was to be produced by a group called the Theater Guild in New York, and in the middle of planning for the show, they went bankrupt. This taught a lesson to Rodgers and Hammerstein I will come back to later. But in the process, Rodgers and Hammerstein took artistic risks and took huge financial risks. So they took a show that had been a stage play, they turned it into non-typical musical comedy, and they called it a musical play. And every element was designed not as frivolous dancing on the stage, but to move the drama forward. The Theater Guild, even though they were going bankrupt, said, you want to hire choreographer Agnes DeMille. Rodgers and Hammerstein weren't so sure, they hadn't met her, and yet they did hire her, and her dream ballet set the model for future musical plays. So they finally decided to call their play Away We Go. Kind of strange. And so then they went out to find investors, because the Theater Guild, as I mentioned, was gone, and it was a hard sell. But they eventually raised enough money, and they opened it for previews in Brookhaven, Connecticut, at the Schubert Theater. Paula and I were just there earlier this week. In March 1943, Walter Winchell reviewed the play. Here's his review. No gags, no girls, no chance. Oops. So a few investors panicked and sold their shares to somebody else, and Rodgers and Hammerstein started to revise it. And meanwhile, they moved it on to the Colonial Theater in Boston, and revised it, and revised it, and revised it. Finally, one of the members of the cast said, you know, you ought to take that tune that's a solo and turn it into a chorus and have us come down the center of the stage in a V. That's that chorus that goes, O-K-L-A-H-O-M-A, Oklahoma. Yeah! It proved to be a hit. It was wonderful. And they kept reworking it. Finally, Rodgers one night pulled the whole cast together and said this, you know what's wrong with the show? Nothing. Now everybody pipe down and go back and go to bed. So opening night came March 31, 1943, opened at New York St. James Theater, and the house was not sold out. They couldn't give tickets away. It was a little more than half full. But those who attended it found that they left cheering a huge hit. Agnes DeMille, who you remember was Irish choreographer, said, they were roaring, they were howling. People hadn't seen boys and girls dance like this in so long. Of course, they had been dancing like this, but just not where the audience could see them. In any case, this musical turned Alfred Drake, many of us remember him, into the top male lead on Broadway, and Celeste Holm as Ado Annie, top female lead. She later became a screen actress, and the reviews were almost unanimous raves. What is interesting is that now Dick and Oscar, as they became known, they were a surefire combination. They were on the lips of everybody at home. Everybody knew this tune, or this show. It ran for 3 years in London, it toured the US, it was turned into a movie. Again, before Oklahoma, composer lyricists were merely songwriters. Now they were dramatists. They wrote songs, of course, but it all moved the drama forward. This set the standard for new Broadway musicals. Shows after that continued on using this as a model. But I think one of the reasons we all like Rodgers and Hammerstein is they stand for goodness, fairness, romance. The shows were at the base warm. Now go on to the next one, John, please. They were warm, heartwarming shows. And, you know, some people today call that cornball or hokey, but those attributes meant a lot to people in the mid-20th century, and I think to many of us still today. Another interesting first is many of us have cast recordings of shows. The first cast recording of a whole show was Oklahoma. Up until that time, a few tunes from a show might make it onto a record. But in this case, every tune made it onto a record, cast recording. And Rodgers and Hammerstein started that, and guess who pocketed the money? The two of them. Became the richest songwriting team on Broadway, even to this day. So Broadway entered a new commercial era. It's the golden era of Broadway, 50s, 60s, 70s. 1945, 2 years after Oklahoma, Rodgers and Hammerstein got together again to write Carousel. This is the story of Billy Bigelow and Julie Jordan. They're young New Englanders who fall in love, but when Julie becomes pregnant, which was a very unusual subject to put into musical in 1945, Billy tries to provide for the unborn child, and he takes part in a robbery and dies by falling on his own knife. Later on, if you remember, he returns back to see his daughter at her graduation. We're going to show you in the show today some of that video from the movie. So as we sing You'll Never Walk Alone, you'll get to see Billy coming back to counsel his daughter appropriately. This was another memorable score. It had You'll Never Walk Alone, If I Loved You, a bunch of tunes that were never quite as popular as Oklahoma, but still were just wonderful tunes. We're going to do all of those tunes in the concert today. 1945 was also kind of a banner year for Rodgers and Hammerstein because they also produced a movie. It's the only movie they produced called State Fair. And it was an unusual kind of thing for them because they were constricted to the director of the movie and then to take orders from somebody else, which they didn't appreciate too much. We'll do some tune from there as well. 46, they produced Annie Get Your Gun. Little known fact, Irving Berlin wrote Annie Get Your Gun. He didn't have the financial resources to produce it, so Rodgers and Hammerstein, along with Dorothy Fields, actually produced the show on Broadway and collected their earnings. 1947, Allegro came along. It was about a small-town doctor. He lost his ideals, was destroyed by ambition. Another kind of cutting edge for the era subject. And the tune that we all know from it is The Gentleman is a Dope, perhaps the only swing tune they ever wrote. We're going to do that today, too, to give you a total contrast to the style we know of or think of when we think of Rodgers and Hammerstein. 1949, South Pacific. Many of us, that's our favorite show. But this one also took some risks. It was set in the South Pacific Island. It took two stories by James Michener. It involved a military nurse who fell in love with a French planter, a Navy lieutenant who gave his heart to a Polynesian girl, and for one of the first times in a Broadway musical, white Americans are forced to confront bigotry, their own bigotry, and learn from that. And it was set, of course, in among the times of war, and just after World War II, so it was appropriate for the era, but it brought real lessons in racial conciliation. It starred Ezio Pizza, the opera star, and Mary Martin. It was well done. You'll know the tunes, and we'll do them today. Some Enchanted Evening, Younger Than Springtime, Bali High, I'm in Love with a Wonderful Guy. And this one, by then, was sold out before it even got to New York. There was no dance in South Pacific. It told two love stories, not just one love story. The dramatic tension did not involve a bad guy or a terrible person. It involved these racial differences and age differences between the French planter and the Navy nurse. And both of the love stories were told simultaneously. This one confirmed Rodgers Hammerstein as the kings of Broadway and kept them on that pedestal for the next 10 years. People called it the RH factor. It's a different RH factor from what most of us think of medically. Won 10 Tony Awards. Then Rodgers said one of his most famous quotes, "It is not our intention to die broke if we can help it." They set up a whole series of business arrangements to produce their shows and to control the reproduction of their shows when they were done in revival. In fact, for the music today, everything we're doing today are the original arrangements. They're the original arrangements either from Broadway or from the movie version. We rented them all from the Rodgers and Hammerstein Library, Rodgers Hammerstein Concert Library, and I guarantee you, I understand that they did not die broke. Because we had to pay a pretty price for the rental of the piece. But it's just wonderful to play the original version in all the original sonority. It's just nice and full. So by the time the 50s came, they had moved along. They did The King and I, took place in Thailand, contrasted Western and Eastern cultures. Actually, Gertrude Lawrence suggested the show. She starred in it and died during the first run. But the show made Yul Brynner famous. And he was suggested at Mary Martin's urging, not Gertrude Lawrence, but he was a friend of Mary Martin, who, as you recall, was in South Pacific. And brought Yul Brynner in, and he made a lifetime of reviving the King in The King and I, as well as playing cowboys in Western flicks. 57, Rodgers Hammerstein did another unusual thing, did a TV musical, Cinderella, which brought out an then little-known female vocalist named Julie Andrews. It was aimed at a more family-friendly audience. After that, they did Flower Drum Song, again turning to San Francisco's Chinatown, another Far Eastern influenced show. That include I Enjoy Being a Girl, Love Look Away, you'll hear them today. And then 1959, The Sound of Music, their last great show. Story of Austria's Trapp family sisters, their escape from the Nazis, and it included Do Re Mi, My Favorite Things, Edelweiss, and Mary Martin was back as the original, as Julie Andrews did the part of Maria in the movie, not on Broadway. Yeah. Many people thought it was kind of a sentimental, old-fashioned show, but really, it was about how the Nazis' influence was taking down the culture, and people stood by and didn't do anything about it. It was really a chance to bring to the fore the fact that we do need to engage evil when we see it and do something about it. This was the background of all of this. But so it was really much more literate kind of musical than the song Do Re Mi implies. A few months after the opening of Sound of Music, Oscar Hammerstein died. More than anybody else, he had turned the innocuous Broadway song and dance musical into a dramatic play. Hammerstein's in an interview with Mike Wallace, this is Mike Wallace before 60 Minutes, tells this interesting anecdote about himself. He said, I was jaywalking in New York City. I ran across 8th Avenue and 57th Street. When I was halfway across the street, I heard a voice calling to me, and it was a cop. And I thought, well, here it is. I'm wrong, he's right. I can't defend myself, I have to take a bawling out. When I reached the curb, he didn't bawl me out at all. He said, aren't you Oscar Hammerstein? I said, yeah. He said, well, I want to tell you how much my family, my wife, and my kids enjoy all your songs. We have a record album of Carousel, and we've worn it out. We can hardly hear it anymore. It's scratchy, but we love it, and we want to thank you. So I thanked him for telling me so and felt very good, and I started to go, and he said, wait a minute. Just one more thing. Do you mind if I ask you a question? Are you religious? And I said, well, I don't belong to any church. And then the cop patted me on the back and said, ah, but you're religious, all right. And I went on feeling as if I'd been caught and feeling that I was religious. He had discovered from the words of my songs that I had faith. Faith in mankind, faith that there was something more powerful than mankind behind it all, and faith that in the long run, good triumphs over evil. If that's religion, I'm religious. And it is my definition of religion. That kind of tells us a little bit about all of these lyrics that Oscar Hammerstein wrote. More than 4 decades after his death, there are revivals of his shows all around the world. Oklahoma's playing a revival on Broadway as we speak this afternoon, or as I speak this afternoon. Richard Rodgers went on to write some shows on his own. He tried writing both the words and music for a show called No Strings. He collaborated with Stephen Sondheim and Martin Charnin, Sheldon Harnick on some other shows. They all did okay, but they weren't quite the RH factor. Rodgers died in 1979 at the age of 77. He had survived cancer of the jaw, a heart attack, and a laryngectomy. This year is the 40th anniversary of his death. This concert is a tribute to his legacy on that anniversary. 1990, as you see in the picture, the 46th Street Theater was renamed the Richard Rodgers Theater in his memory. And now I close with a quote from Richard Rodgers. "The audience are the only smart people in show business." Yes, you are. How true.